We've all noticed how marketers use artificial intelligence to sell us more stuff. But can AI also be used for social good? Welcome to The Big Question, the video series from Chicago Booth Review. This episode is being filmed in conjunction with the Kilt Center for Marketing at Chicago Booth. I'm Hal Weitzman, and as always, we've assembled an expert panel. Sanjog Misra is the Charles H. Kelstadt Professor of Marketing at Chicago Booth. Lisa Sullivan-Cross is Head of Growth Marketing at Pinterest. And Murli Buluswar is Head of Analytics at the US Consumer Bank of Citibank. Let's start, Sanjog Misra, with you. And let's define our terms. We've all heard about AI, but what do you mean by AI? And specifically, how does AI relate to targeted marketing?
Yeah, so the term AI isn't a new one. Originally, it was coined in 1953. And essentially, you want to think of artificial intelligence as being any time a machine can do something that a human being would have expended intelligence to do, right? That's the broadest definition of AI. But typically, when we think about AI in the context of marketing, what we're really referring to is this ability to get machines to learn something from large quantities of data. And in particular, what we've become reasonably good at is taking large amounts of data and essentially uncovering what people's tastes, preferences, what their needs are, and then using those to build scalable algorithms then that can deliver customized marketing interventions. So these could be products. So, Murli could design kind of customized a portfolio of offerings for customers, or Pinterest could learn about what their customers are interested in and make really smart recommendations. And so the benefits kind of to consumers is kind of this close match, if you will, between what their needs and what their preferences are and what they actually end up getting.
And give us a sense of the scale. I mean, how widespread is the use of AI in targeted marketing in the US, say?
It's growing, I would say close to exponentially. If you go back, let's say, about 15 years ago, the idea kind of existed, but we didn't have the infrastructure, the machinery, if you will, to put this into practice. Data has been growing faster than computing power, and our ability to kind of learn from data has been growing as well. So now you have tools like deep learning and various new versions of machine learning that can scale to these large amounts of data. As far as kind of actual practice goes, we've got people from the financial sector, from kind of the general online space. Any place where there is large amounts of data, there's been a push towards using AI, right? So I think what we're going to see is in the next 5 to 10 years, even in industries that we would have normally thought of as being lagging on the technology space, it's kind of going to become ubiquitous, the use of AI and kind of machine learning and deep learning.
Right, but this was still relatively at the early stages of this revolution in marketing.
Yeah, it depends on what you call early stages, right? I think we've learned a lot. So the constructs that we think of as being useful in AI and marketing, those go back to work that's been done, for example, at the University of Chicago 20, 30 years ago, right? Peter Rossi and in some sense, the Kilt Center was kind of created to be a repository for large amounts of data that then could be used for algorithmic marketing and AI type tools. What's changing now is that we've been able to kind of do a lot more and scale down to the individual user, right? So we knew how to do it in broad classes. Now we can essentially tailor marketing interventions down to the most granular level possible.
Okay, well, thanks for that overview, Sanjog. Lisa and Murli, I want to turn to you to hear about how your companies are actually using AI specifically to improve your marketing. So Lisa, let me start with you. At Pinterest, how do you think about AI? How does it help you do your marketing?
Yeah, so similar to what Sanjog talked about, we really use the term machine learning, which is a part of AI. To identify patterns and make decisions with minimal human intervention to make a user's experience with the product better. So if done right, AI can be instrumental in growing your business and it can make the user or customer's life better. So we have three big tenets that we follow when we're implementing machine learning at Pinterest. One is customer first, respect the customer. So use their data, their behavioral data, to benefit them, not to take advantage of them. The second is technically be the best. So we have amazing engineering and data science resources and team members that can build out the best products for our users. And then third, make sure that the machine learning or AI feature is core to your business or your mission. So our mission at Pinterest is to bring everyone the inspiration to create a life they love. And we make sure that any machine learning that we use ladders up to that mission. So I think where a lot of companies make mistakes is they may use AI to build a bell and whistle that's an adjunct to their product that might just be gratuitous or fun to use. And it doesn't help really grow the business in that way because it's not in line with the mission and not keeping the customer in mind as much as it should. So specifically at Pinterest, one example is we track a user's behavior and say they're searching for, I'm doing this right now, a DIY kitchen project. So we're redoing our kitchen. So because that's how I've used Pinterest, I'm on there searching for kitchen projects. Now my experience changes when I visit Pinterest. It serves up content that's all about kitchen remodels, and specifically if I were looking for lighting options, it would serve that up. And then we use that also in things like our email and mobile push notifications. So it's all tailored to the individual person. And it doesn't take a lot of human involvement on our end, for example, to create an email for a customer, because we look at their behavior and how they use the product to create and automatically put that content together in that email.
Mm-hmm. Well, Murli, talk to us about how you use AI for marketing.
Absolutely, Hal. So our mission, very similar to what Sanjog and Lisa were saying, is really to develop real-time contextual relevance with our customers. And in our world where we traverse digital and physical, what's really critical is that the conversation we have with our customers is pretty consistent regardless of whether it's a physical branch or a call center or a new mobile app or online. And so my team's mission really as an analytics function is to say, look, historically, analytics teams are pretty good at predicting things, but they're not necessarily quite as good at saying, what do you do with this? What is the implication and application of this? And so there's really three dimensions to what we're focused on. Number one is prediction using advanced analytics. Number two is primary research to understand why the customer is making the choices he or she is making. And number three is to develop a robust design of experiments capabilities that can actually create sort of this industrialized test and learn environment where we could actually try different types of engagements and different types of associations to predictions in order to build more relevance. And historically, what's happened is in large organizations like ours, when you have an interaction in a call center or a branch or with an ATM or with a more digital channel, that data and that interaction has remained in that silo. And what we're in the throes of doing is being able to stitch that across channels and draw meaning from that in ways that helps us understand you, with the goal of really three things. Number one is to be able to predict and preempt customer service issues. Number two is to delight you in ways that you might not have imagined. And number three is to understand your financial needs, even if you haven't necessarily come to us, and build more relevance on that dimension as well. So we really see data as being at the core, and this notion of machine learning and advanced analytics being at the core of developing unparalleled cross-channel, cross-product customer intelligence.
And that's fascinating that you talk about the silos that existed that you're trying to break down, because of course we think of data collection as being a sort of, as being something that's chiefly done in a digital environment, but you're talking about data collection being at your local bank branch or whatever, which is fascinating. I want to turn to the question, though, of the social impact of AI, because that's what we're here to discuss. And so, Lisa, let me start with you, because you drew this distinction between doing what's best for the consumer as opposed to doing something nefarious with their data. Talk a little bit more about that and how Pinterest navigates that line.
Yeah. I mean, we're very very strict about that at Pinterest. So I think that guides all of our decisions in this area. I can talk about a really interesting way we're using machine learning to make a positive difference in people's lives. One of the products we launched about a year ago is Inclusive Beauty. So it's a skin tone search feature that uses machine vision to sort pins, that's our content, in the site's beauty category by skin tone. So the user triggers this initially because we've given them the option to refine their searches based on skin tone. So once they do that, we learn from them that this is what they're interested in, and we're able to serve up an experience and content for them that's more in line with what they're looking for. And it's something that we developed to make the Pinterest experience better for the user, and it's ended up really helping our growth. And so that's an example of if you have some purity in why you're developing these AI or machine learning features, what's good for the customer ends up being good for the business long term. We've developed an augmented reality try-on feature that leverages the skin tone, for example, that can really allow users to try on lipstick and eyeshadow, but it's specific to their skin tone versus before we had this product when it wasn't. And so it wasn't as good of an experience for people of color on Pinterest. And we strive to make Pinterest accessible to everyone.
Okay, Murli, what about at Citi? I know you think about social impact and particularly how you can use AI to help communities that are underbanked, for example. So talk to us a little bit more about that. How do you think about using AI and marketing to have a positive social impact?
Thank you, Hal. So there's really two dimensions to that. Number one is being able to tap into a wider range of data in addition to the traditional credit reports to understand customer behavior and to understand customer risk at deeper levels and in more dynamic ways than ever before. Historically, as you know, banks have relied on credit reports, and they're valuable to a certain point, but are limiting in the sense that they can be a little bit static, and they're also very retrospective, and you've got a vast underbanked population. Here in the US, we've invested in a startup named Perch, and our intent there is to find a gateway into using a wider range of data, such as your cell phone behavior patterns or your cell phone payment patterns and things of that nature, to understand your credit risk and your credit worthiness at a deeper level than one might be able to tap into using traditional credit variables from the bureaus. The other piece of the opportunity that I see is being able to influence outcomes. So to engage with customers, prospective and current customers, to preempt adverse situations. For example, going back to the instance of being able to stitch together data across channels, our intent is to be able to find patterns on customer payments, such as do they pay their utility bill at a certain time of the month, and to be able to know whether they've got enough of a balance in that month in their account to be able to avoid an insufficient fund situation. So really sort of thinking about the customer needs in more proactive ways at a deeper level, and engaging with customers in ways that preempts the likelihood of adverse outcomes. And the third dimension is using a much broader range of data to be able to predict customer credit worthiness.
So it sounds like when you talk about targeted marketing, you're really targeting right down to the individual, his or her actions or behavior, and then trying to mesh that with the financial circumstances they're in to help them avoid a bad outcome or achieve a better outcome.
That's right. It really does get at this notion of real-time, contextual, highly dynamic, because it's not just that individual over a broad period of time. Our context changes, maybe not day to day, but perhaps from week to week and certainly month to month. And how do we separate signal from noise to be able to tap into all of that data that we as a firm have on your habits, and to glean from that data meaning that could build deeper relevance to you as a customer, above and beyond wanting to engage with you on your additional financial needs.
Sanjog Mishra, let me come back to you, because I know you've done work with non-profits, helping them to deploy AI to improve their marketing and their efforts generally. Tell us about some of the work you've done and what you've learned.
Sure. So some time ago, started thinking about taking some of the tools that, the machinery that we had developed here at Booth, and using it to do good. So as the topic for today suggests. So one project that I worked on was with the SNAP program. This is the food stamp program. And it turns out, for example, even during the pandemic, people who are eligible and have qualified for SNAP. So what happens is that at a 6-month, there's a trigger where you have to refile kind of a form, a simple 2-page form that makes sure that you're continually eligible for benefits. And if you don't fill out that form, you lose your food stamp benefits, right? And you'll be, I was shocked to learn that about 80% of people who come up for that recertification, as it's called, just fail to fill out the form, and then they lose their benefits, right? So, and you could think of this as essentially a churn problem, right? Like from a marketing point of view. So what we did was we ran an experiment, and we used deep learning to kind of learn what elements of a message resonate with a particular participant, right? So the goal was to try and get them or remind them. So in the class of kind of interventions that my colleague here, Dick Taylor, would call a nudge. So we're not changing their incentives, we're not changing anything else, we're just algorithmically creating nudges that are personalized with language that resonates with the participant. And we managed to get like a 30% bump in the recertification rates just by sending them timed reminders, which told them to come out and fill out the form, right? So I think this massive avenue for using AI and targeted marketing in the public goods sector. And that's the success of that campaign has kind of led us. So my partner is this organization called Code for America that tries to help governmental agencies digitize strategies. And so now we're thinking of using it for earned income tax credits or any other place where we might be able to take large amounts of data that are already available, layer on this targeted marketing AI layer, and then just, try and get, more good done than otherwise would have happened.
Right, and that's interesting because I guess we don't really think of those campaigns as using AI traditionally. Is there anything that you've learned from doing that surprised you that you can take back and do more research? You want to do more research about?
Yeah, so I think the most interesting thing that I've learned is that not personalizing has a massive social cost. So there's this typical idea that personalization is kind of a bad thing, right? We are exploiting customers. So in the context of like these social programs, what I found was if we had one message that went out to everybody, right? So the standard thing that most organizations do, which is we send out a typical reminder, the people who respond are the ones who are better off, right? They have the time, they're comfortable. So for example, in my data set, they have positive income, they're not living on the streets. The people who don't respond to this uniform treatment are the ones that have zero income, they're on the streets, their living conditions are, fairly dire. But once you personalize, the entire distribution of people who respond shift. So the people who actually now come into the fold are those people who have no income, they're living in their car or on the streets. And because the message has been tailored for them, you get them to participate. So in some sense, it's this thing where rather than AI being bad, without it, we would have actually, hurt the very people that we were trying to help, right? So that was an interesting kind of angle on personalization that I hadn't thought about. And I have continuing work with JP, for example, on showing that even with pricing, this is true. That if you think about personalizing prices, people think of that as being a bad thing, but if you just sit down and think for a little bit, the ability to personalize prices allows people who would not have bought your product or availed of your service at kind of the uniform price, now that they've gotten a discount because of the personalization, they become your customers, right? So if you start thinking about the distribution of your customer base rather than kind of just the average or the total profit, you can see huge benefits that machine learning and deep learning and AI bring to the table, both on the commercial side and on the social side.
That's fascinating. But as you said, there are a lot of concerns, and particularly around the use of data and privacy issues related to individual consumers. And for example, in Europe, we've seen in the European Union pretty strong legislation to try to protect data privacy for individuals. I wonder, Murli, if you ever thought about what effect those regulations have had. Have they done what they were intended to do?
So that's a gnarly issue, isn't it? This notion of privacy in a world of free. It reminds me of the quote from the documentary, I guess, Social Dilemma, where the quote is, look, if you don't know what's being sold, then you're the product that's being sold. And I think the fundamental dilemma we have is we as consumers want things for free. And when we want things for free, and that's probably the most powerful way for the providers of free to be making a boatload of money. So my hope is that as the years progress in our thinking, we're able to come up with different degrees of consumer awareness and consent when it comes to the sharing of data, such that you could have at one end of the spectrum completely closed loop, no data sharing sort of capabilities in a platform, all the way through, I don't mind being a product. So I don't think that this issue has been laid to rest anywhere close, but I do think that creating more awareness and giving consumers the ability to make more overt choices around the degree to which they feel comfortable sharing their data is really, really critical. On the other hand, coming back to your precise question, Hal, look, you could have all the legislations in the world, and there's always sort of loopholes around it. The guiding principle for me is that any regulation should set the lowest bar, not the highest bar. The highest bar really is, what are we using this data for, to what purpose, and do our customers understand what data we're using and how we're using it and why they would find that meaningful? And if we could answer that higher order question, especially in a world where we're stitching together all of these data elements, as I alluded to earlier, then we feel like we've set a much, much higher bar for not just what is permissible, but what is right and what is readily defensible.
Right, and it's an interesting idea to kind of educate consumers about what, to try and get them to understand what their preferences are and how they would like to set the dial. I guess that would require a lot of transparency and greater education about how those data are being used by organizations, and that's pretty varied, right? Lisa, I wanted to ask you about how it works at Pinterest. How do you think about the issue of protecting consumer privacy?
Yeah, it's very important to us, and I think it does come back to yes, of course we're abiding by all of the laws and guidelines, but I think you have to go further than that and as I mentioned earlier, really put the customer first and respect the customer, and only share, use, collect data that's going to make their life better or their experience better. So I think we have a really good track record with our customers on this. We use the bare minimum we need to make a user's experience better. One example is we're one of the very few apps that we don't collect geolocation in the app, and we do not ask for zip code when somebody signs up. So we're a bit blind as to that specific information because we haven't received that from the user. Now, we could have grown our revenue probably a lot more quickly if we had that information, because advertisers like to advertise locally, and that information would help us grow much more quickly there. But instead, we've chosen to focus on the customer and only collect that when we do have a use for it that would make the customer's life better, and we just don't have a compelling enough use for it yet. So I think the result of that is our just unprecedented organic user growth, and our revenue has grown greatly over time, but we've really focused on the user experience and growing the user base, and then the revenue will come, right? And so I think it's just so important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, so are you suggesting that, just so I understand, do consumers know that they're not having their geolocation information being collected and stored, and they actually like that? Is that what you're saying?
I don't know if consciously they are making that connection in their head, but they do know that when they install apps, a lot of them have the pop-up that says, we'd like to collect your geolocation, and we don't do that. So that's one less barrier to the customer downloading the app and using it. But they probably also, somewhere in their minds, remember or realize that, Pinterest did not ask for that information. And of course they know when they register, we don't ask for a lot of information, where with other products and apps, you might have to enter address, zip code, age, things like that. So we just collect, again, the bare minimum we need to make that experience for the customer better. I mean, I used to be the head of growth at Pandora, and in a similar role that I'm at Pinterest. And we had a similar approach and a mandate about customer first. And so for most of my time there, we weren't collecting geolocation, but we finally came up with a compelling reason to do so. And so I think the last year or two I was there, we started collecting geolocation from users, because we determined that, hey, we can make playlist and song and music recommendations based on geolocation. Hey, this is what people in your area are listening to. Or if we know there's a storm on the East Coast, we might serve a different recommendation to you versus if you're commuting, right? Because people have different listening behaviors when they're commuting versus they might listen to podcasts, and when they're at home, they may listen to more laid back music. And so I think you just have to wait until there's a reason to collect that data that makes the customer's life better.
Okay, Sanjog Mishra, I wanted to ask you, are these concerns about data privacy overblown?
I mean, as Murali said, it's a gnarly question. I think there's two sides of this, right? One is making sure that people have control over their own data, right? And what they're sharing voluntarily, and they know what the costs and the benefits are, and being transparent about that. I think those are all important. I think the risk that we have is if there's a blanket regulation that says, thou shalt not collect this particular type of data. Like the example I gave you with the SNAP program, like let's say the CCPA under the California Privacy Act, let's say, if they mandated that you wouldn't be able to use the data to target these messages, well, you can immediately see what the response is, right? So if I shut down the ability to use individuals' data, then we go back into this world where everybody gets the same message, and that literally hurts the bottom rung of society the most. So I think my view on this is we have to be very, very careful about how we think about data. Even the idea of sharing data, right? If consumers are allowed to share data voluntarily, that that also comes at a cost in the sense that now firms have to think about who the people are who are sharing the data and for what purpose, right? Are there strategic reasons for sharing and not sharing? So I have a PhD student who kind of worked on this for her thesis. So I think it's a very difficult question. I think over time we'll kind of muddle our way through. I think the US obviously needs some kind of a overarching privacy legislative framework. We don't have that yet, but what it should be, I think, is something we'll have to learn about. And I'm evading the question, but I don't have a fantastic answer for this. Right? Maybe Murali or Lisa do about it.
Sanjog, if I may just add to what you said, part of it, I think, is bifurcating what data is collected with what purpose is it being used for.
Right.
So it feels like to me those two questions go hand in hand, and regulations are a bit too focused on what data is collected, but really the problem that they're solving for is it being used for justifiable moral purposes? And it feels like to me that's the direction in which the dialogue needs to shift across sectors.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, if you look at the language in the GDPR, the early drafts basically would have completely eliminated any kind of personalized pricing. That includes discounts, right? Like, so I think there's kind of this, push towards let's just stop data from kind of moving around or impose massive costs. And that's another example, right, where the firms that have benefited from GDPR, no offense to Murali, are the big firms because they can actually, they can hire lawyers, they have a legal team, they can navigate the morass of GDPR fairly easily. There's an impact on the smaller firm that doesn't have those resources, and the costs that are imposed by legislation such as the GDPR. Again, I'm not saying that privacy is a bad thing, but the way it's done, I think, may impose costs on society that we did not see coming.
Okay. One more thought on that, if I may help. Pardon me.
Sure. Very quickly, because then I want to turn to the audience questions.
Absolutely. 20 seconds. The irony of this discussion is that the whole point of AI is to de-average and create extreme customization. Yet some of the regulations are moving precisely in the opposite direction of broad brush, legislations that average the world again. So just wanted to call that out. Back to you.
In the words of Monty Python, yes, we are all individuals. Okay, let's go to a question. So I apologize for any mispronunciation of anybody's names here, but these are good questions coming in. A question from Vivek Muruganandam. Can you give some examples of how AI specifically played a role in an initiative? Murali or Lisa?
I could go first. So one simple example is last year, around this time of the year in March and April, much like most of the world, Citi was also reeling under the stress that COVID inflicted on us. And one of our specific problems was our ability to staff call centers, whether they were here in the US or internationally. The world had sort of essentially shut down, but yet that was precisely when the call volume shot through the roof. And so many customers ended up having to wait longer than they wanted to. And we were able to use the data to understand what the customer issue is and to engage with them in offline digital channels to be able to preempt and to be able to solve that issue for them in ways that we couldn't because the hold times in the call center was way too much. So really kind of stitching together that omni-channel data to be able to build relevance and solve customer issues in times when they were under extreme duress because of all the financial and health pressures inflicted by COVID.
Great, thank you. Lisa, did you have a story you wanted to add?
Well, I think the inclusive beauty skin tone filter that I mentioned earlier is a really good example, but I would just say that since Murali brought it up in regards to shelter in place and COVID, I think because we've built such a strong machine learning based product, that it automatically shifts when people went into shelter at home and they needed ideas for how to build a at-home virtual school space for your kid, or projects to do with your kids at home, things like that. People started searching for those things more, and so the content that we serve up changes immediately to reflect those needs and to really anticipate what the customer is going to look for next.
Okay, thank you. So here's another question, interesting one from Elena Nosova. AI has been effective at interpreting mostly quantitative data, purchasing behavior, for example. Oftentimes, purchases can be emotionally driven. What is your perspective on possibilities of AI being used for driving recommendations on real-time interpretation of emotional reaction or potential customers to real-time ads? What companies are already offering such solutions, if you know the answer to that? So emotional reactions and real-time responses. Any thoughts there? Sanjog?
Sure. I was looking to Lisa. Maybe she wants to jump in. But Pandora has has a product where they can figure out like the mood that you are in based on the content of the songs that you're consuming, right? So there is examples of AI tools being used to track, your facial reaction to, your emotive reaction to kind of content that you're consuming online, whether it's videos or pictures and so on. So there's a lot of firms that have actually made investments in trying to use to understand human emotion, but also figure out ways that it can be used. I'm personally not, I've not played around with it, and I'm not aware of an actual product or a service that uses it, but maybe Rahil or Lisa can speak to that.
Yeah, and Sanjog, that's a great example of an inferred emotion and how Pandora uses that. We have used it not in our product, but in market testing our ads. There are companies that we've used where we can have somebody look at an ad that we've created, say a video ad, and then and they've overtly signed up for this, the people using it, the customers, and it tracks their facial reactions to the ad, and then we get data back from that company saying, yeah, this is how people feel when they were watching the ad, or when it got to this point in the ad or that point in the ad. So we've used tools like that to help make our advertising better and make sure that it's hitting the right notes with customers or potential customers.
Okay, thank you. Murli, did you want to add?
Yes, if I may, Hal, thank you. Look, this sort of goes back to my point earlier in the session around how classical AI focuses on prediction. We're still sort of developing the tools to understand why. But one application that my team is engaged in is we get hundreds of thousands, millions of calls on a monthly basis. And we're trying to collect all of that voice and text data from the transcript, and not just do a simple keyword, but to translate that narrative into an emotional pulse of the customer to understand how well we did or not in satisfying, addressing their issue. And if not, then taking actions to be able to sort of follow up on that phone conversation that they might have had. So that's more than natural language processing. It's really trying to get at that emotional tone of that conversation.
I just remembered one really good application. There's a company called Cogito that you can plug into a call center, and in real time it takes the audio and scores it against emotion, and then makes recommendation to the call center agent if the customer is angry, or if the customer has any other emotional response that kind of gets flagged, and the agent sees not just kind of the emotion of the customer and where they're going, but also suggestions like slow down the way you speak, be more deliberate, and starts making like positive recommendations for the agent to be able to deal with that particular customer. So that's one example at least that uses emotional AI in real time.
Okay, well, based on the data that I'm receiving, we have high customer engagement here on this event. So let's squeeze in another couple of questions. This is from Rahil Singh. A lot of analytical models are not necessarily understood by everyone in a company. So how should an organization institutionalize the use of AI in its business? And what risks can you foresee when an inexperienced company implements AI, even with the best of intentions? Sanjog, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, so I think there's a push towards something called explainable AI, right? That's my gut reaction to the question, which is there's work being done that takes the black box that people usually think about in terms of deep learning and machine learning, and then creates essentially an English language representation of what that model does. Partly this is again coming about because of requirements in GDPR, which require you to explain how your analytics actually worked, and if a customer asks you. I think that can also be used internally to explain to employees what that black box does and why and how you should use it. I think where we are today, at least my interactions with a large number of firms, is this human plus AI approach is where I think we should be, rather than take the AI and just implement the decisions directly. Think of AI as being an assistive technology that goes to the human decision maker and gives them options. Just like the call center example, there's a pricing recommendation engine for hotels, for example, where the software says here's what the room should be priced at today, but then the pricing manager can accept or reject depending on their own judgment. And slowly, like via repeated interactions, the AI gets better and learns what's working and what's not working. So I think it's a really good question. I think a partnership with the engineering team and the product/marketing team, I think, is a good place to go in terms of making this endeavor work.
Okay, do our other panelists have any thoughts on that one? Or should we move on?
Jump in if I may. Sure. I'm always amused by this question because I think the problem of explainable human is a much more interesting one than the problem of explainable AI. Look, I mean, at the end of the day, I do think it's that magic of human and machine intelligence that really does matter. Now, the AI is obviously phenomenal at finding deeper levels of connections, correlations, not causations. And where the human intelligence can come in is to be able to make sense of that. Sometimes it might confirm their hypothesis, sometimes it might actually challenge their hypothesis, but the magic almost invariably will happen at that intersection. And another piece of your question, Hal, was around how do people get started and how do they get scale on AI? Think of it at the end of the day as a tool. The question that I would ask is, what are the problems that you want to solve for and why do they matter? So unless and until you could reimagine as a senior leader in your firm, what decisions are going to be made and how decisions are going to be made differently as a consequence of this tool, you shouldn't be focused on this tool. You should be focused on your strategy first.
Right. I think that's what we've seen in the past, right? Companies collecting data just because they could, not because they knew what they wanted to do with it. Lisa, I have a specific question for you, so let me get that in. This is from Christian Efken, who wants to ask, can you please comment on how your company thinks about the user data you are using and any implicit biases in your machine learning models?
I think there are instances where we need to go in and adjust for that or correct for that. So that is a human involvement, and we do that. I think one of the implicit biases that we developed the inclusive beauty and skin tone filtering specifically for is that when people would come to Pinterest users and search for hairstyles or short hairstyles, it would be a bunch of white women that showed up on the screen, and we know that wasn't reflective of who was using the product. And so instead of just relying on the behavior-based machine learning that is supposed to give the right content, it just wasn't right enough. And so we had to go in and build an AI sort of machine learning feature on top of the what we already thought was a solid machine learning to adjust for that bias.
Okay, Sanjog, did you have a thought on implicit bias?
Yeah, I think there's ongoing research on this as well, right? Our colleague here, Sendil Mullainathan, and Marianne Bertrand have worked on this quite a bit. I think partly just being cognizant of the fact that these biases exist and we may or may not be aware of them is a good starting point. Sendil likes to say that our best hope for debiasing algorithms are algorithms themselves. Right, so human beings have biases too, and you have to be a little bit careful that we're not injecting the human bias into the algorithm. So, I think, for example, when it comes to making sure that we don't condition on on characteristics that we are either legally or morally obligated not to include into the model, there's this tendency to kind of ignore that data, whereas maybe the response with the algorithm should actually internalize that data and then explicitly not use it for recommendations. Right, so I think we need to start thinking a little bit deeper in terms of where these biases are, where they could manifest themselves, to recognize the fact that we may not be able to see them, and then allow the algorithm to kind of, as Murali put, like challenge our hypotheses around what we think is kind of the right way to go.
Okay, one more question, or a couple more questions. I think this one from. Apologies for the way I'm going to pronounce your name. Ugish Spruds. Has your company, I'm paraphrasing here, has your company's ability to use AI to automate your marketing response or your strategies to COVID been hampered by restrictions on information access? Let's Murali, can you address that?
No, the short answer is that COVID has been a precipitating force because of how fundamental and sudden that change has been. So we've really learned to adapt to it in ways that, frankly, we might not have otherwise, certainly at the speed that we did. One simple example of that is in the height of the COVID crisis, particularly in the New York area in March and April of last year, we were grappling with understanding which branches should we open, for what hours, what cash availability is there in these branches in order to make sure that our customers who are in need are supported. And we were able to sort of create that data plumbing and predictive algorithms to understand where we might have issues and how we sort of manage the whole logistics of branch opening and closure and cash availability in much more preemptive ways. Would we have gotten there eventually? Sure. But COVID was, in that sense, a force for some positive change.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, did that affect you guys at all, or is it because you don't have physical locations, was that less of an issue?
Yeah, I mean, it impacted us, our user growth in a very positive way, just organically, because people had more of a need for Pinterest, because they have more time, they're at home with their families, they need to find things to do, and Pinterest is a good resource for that. I think where it impacted us, maybe in a negative way, is in our advertising. We had a brand marketing or advertising campaign planned for 2020 before COVID and shelter in place that had a lot of out of home, so subway takeovers and public transit and things like that. So we paused that campaign because obviously people weren't taking public transportation and out in the world, and so we had to really rethink that and take a step back. And we also didn't want the creative to be tone deaf, and so that kind of pushed that out a bit. So that's one way that it impacted the marketing organization anyway. But as far as our business as a whole, it's Pinterest has been able to really be there to help people through shelter in place to some extent.
Okay, well, I want to finish off by asking you, because we are here to do marketing, talk about marketing for good. So very briefly, 30 seconds if you can, tell us, how would you use AI to tackle one social cause that is important to you? Murali, Murli, let me start with you.
Predicting the return on one's college loans. So it's a big issue right now. We've got many, many students that are in the red, borrowing tons of money to further their college education. And we could use AI to help those students understand what's the return on that investment and that loan, so that they have a richer understanding of how much they could actually afford to take that loan on for their college education without being burdened excessively post-graduation.
Excellent. Of course, the University of Chicago, particularly Chicago Booth, is always a good investment. I have to say that legally. Sanjog, what was your one cause?
So mine is a class of causes, but it'll qualify as one: lowering the bandwidth or the cost of making good decisions in the most disadvantaged population. So the SNAP example is one, but it turns out that people who are most disadvantaged have a very difficult time making decisions that you and I would think of as being, obvious and easy decisions to make. So using AI and data to help them make those decisions, or just showing them the way, I think that would be an awesome way to go.
Okay, and Lisa, your social cause that you would use AI for?
Yeah, so mine is really in line with my involvement in the nonprofit Women's Audio Mission that you mentioned at the beginning. So I would love to find a way to use AI to increase representation of women and underrepresented minorities in fields and at career levels where they're grossly underrepresented.
Excellent. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, but unfortunately our time is up. My thanks to our panel, Sanjog Misra, Lisa Sullivan-Cross, and Murli Buluswar, and my thanks to the Kilt Center for Marketing for organizing this session. For more research, analysis, and commentary, visit us online at review.chicagobooth.edu and join us again next time for another Big Question. Goodbye.